Few Texans players get W's against the league. The Texans continue to prepare for the draft. And the offensive line wide receiver, which one would you rather fix, assuming that you have to decide? And you probably do. Let's go inside the locker room.
It's the locker room on YouTube. You know what it is. Let's get it. Hey, locker room. Yeah, we in the locker room. Texas talk. Yeah, you know what we about to do. Localize every angle's what we really do. We the source. We the pulse of the city too. Landlocked. Got the
All right, it is the locker room, number one source for Texans digital content. I am Landry Locker. Be at the Combine in less than a week. And the Texans, they're preparing. They're preparing for the NFL Combine. Couple of wins today for the Houston Texans. We'll get into that. We'll also get into some of the draft topics that are sticking out. And I ran across something. I don't know if y'all have on your desktop, like just random news things that sometimes typically you scroll through. Kind of a slow news time. I saw a hypothetical about a Texan star player, and I kind of clicked on it and I started thinking. So we'll find out how outlandish y'all think that is. Be sure to partake in the comments, all that type of stuff. Appreciate y'all for coming through. It is the locker room, number one source for Texans digital content. So I want to start with a question. And this is about the offensive line, because Cody Stutz and I on SNL today, we did a mock draft, and the mock draft kind of played out to where we didn't take any offensive linemen. And we were open to it. It just played out. And in this mock draft, we approached it as if, okay, you got to get one of the two best tight ends. We ended up getting one of the two best tight ends. And as the draft went on, we didn't get an offensive lineman. And there were a lot of people in the comments, upset that there weren't any offensive linemen taken. And the hard thing about mock drafts is, number one, it's damn near pointless to do before free agency. I know people like to put up their mock drafts, but before free agency, it's really tough to do mock drafts. And with the Texans, especially, that they're going to get wide receivers, and that they're probably going to address defensive line. We don't know what they're going to do on the offensive line. So here's my question. Is changing offensive line personnel more important than improving skill position guys? Because every time you draft an offensive lineman, it's at the sake of not drafting a skill position guy. Every time you draft a skill position guy, it's at the sake of not drafting an offensive lineman. So my question is, which do you think is more important with this Texans roster? Do you think that getting new guys on the offensive line is more important? Or do you think getting better skill guys is more important? Because the answer for me is kind of easy. Obviously, you want to improve the offensive line. I just think that the checks that have been cashed, or the checks that have been written, kind of make it a little bit difficult to be able to handle the offensive line. And we hear all this stuff about coaching up the offensive linemen, and I think that's going to be as crucial as anything, because you have Blake Fisher at at right tackle. Right tackle for now. You got to think they're going to give Juice Scruggs another go at it to try to be one of the starters somewhere. Laremy Tunsil, I don't think he's going anywhere, although we'll talk about what I came across today. So which is more important? Because I think it's the skill guys. I don't think that this offensive line is going to be great. I just think with the way that it's laid out and with the money that you have invested, and the Texans have the second most invested in their offensive line. With the way that that's laid out, I don't know how the Texans are going to be able to the Texans are going to be able to really, really just bring in personnel. The other thing is they need interior guys. The top interior guy on the market is going to be expensive as hell. The prime draft equity, there's better opportunity to get skill guys. So they're kind of in a weird spot there as well. So what are you trying to do? What is the goal? What are the Texans gonna get when it comes to offensive linemen? I think they're gonna have to coach these guys up. I think eventually they would love to overhaul the offensive line. I don't know that that's important. And this is always, it always seems like it just becomes simp central when we start talking about the offensive line. How can you throw a good ball whenever your OL isn't talented? You think every offensive line in the league is talented? Like do you think that the Bengals had a good offensive line this year? Like it's a lot that we saw the Texans last year. They were able to throw the ball. It was a historic rookie season for CJ Stroud. How were they able to do that? So we always just assume, well, it starts up front. Well, receivers can make the offensive line better. They get open quicker. Running backs can make the offensive line better. We saw that with Joe Mixon. Seems like whenever we talk about the offensive line, it just becomes like real football simp central, where it's like, well, nobody could run behind that offensive line. That was what people were saying about Dameon Pierce last year. What happened? They put in Singletary. Singletary did his thing. Joe Mixon this year, he did his thing. He was a Pro Bowl player despite playing behind a bad offensive line. So you can coach these guys up. You obviously need someone that's not Bobby Slowick, that's not just going to call plays to put these guys in bad positions.
Damn it, Bobby.
But this notion that you have to have a talented offensive line and you can't overcome things with good skill position guys, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It sounds cool, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. Explain to me why the Texans were able to do what they did last year with that offensive line. So there's ways to figure it out. And sometimes it's not an either or thing. It's kind of a situation where the card you've been dealt is what it is. The card you've been dealt with this offensive line for the next season, it's bad. The wide receivers, you have one guy under contract that you can trust. So if you had to choose between, I guess this is another way to ask it. If you had to choose between adding a really good wide receiver in free agency and a premium draft pick at wide receiver and rolling with, for the most part, this version of the offensive line, would you rather have that, or would you rather have this offensive line, or would you rather have an improved offensive line with all your premium going to that and John Mechie, Xavier Hutchinson, and Nico Collins? Like, come on. Like, you can't, no one with a straight face can say that you would rather have an improved offensive line and those wide receivers. That doesn't work that way at all. It doesn't work that way at all. Ladarian Reed says, I couldn't agree more. Just wait till next year's draft. You can get better OL moves, and hopefully Nick has learned from the horrible OL contracts. And hopefully they're coached up. Because I don't think you're going to coach John Mechie and Xavier Hutchinson into being winning wide receiver pieces. I don't believe in them like that. We've seen them win with a large chunk of this offensive line with Bobby Slowick. Not all of them, but we've seen them win. They need to be better coached. Do I recommend running back all five? Hell no. I think obviously you need to make at least one change, preferably at right guard. But this notion that you go into the draft and you go offensive line heavy, you got other needs. And I think the skill position talent is more important. Of course, you would like to fix both. And maybe if you're resourceful, if you're aggressive, if you evaluate right, maybe you'll be able to do that. But there's a lot of work to do for this front office. I mean, there is a hell of a lot of work to do with this front office. Brandon says you're not coaching Kenyon Green and Shaq Nelson. They're not even starters. Like, what do they even have to do with anything? They're not even starters. You have other offensive linemen outside of them, so they're not even starters. But I say all that to say, I think the wide receiver position at this point is more important. I would say it's more important than the offensive line. And it's also based on what you're stuck with and what the front office has left you with. Just kind of where it is. We always hear about, well, you got to have a really, really good tackle. You realize the Texans won the division in 2018 with Julian Davenport at tackle. It's the most games that they've won in a long time. They won 11-5 with Julian Davenport at left tackle. They have Laremy Tunsil. They're still doing around the same thing. Now, maybe they had a higher ceiling. They did the exact same thing the next year. Now, they won a playoff game, but they went 10-6, and they were in the same area, the same range. So how much of a difference does it make? I think coaching can help. I think it can be overcome. I think skill position guys can help as well. News with the Texans today. Diana Rossini had it. The Joe Mixon and Will Anderson appeals were successful. How about that? A successful appeal in the NFL. We have a successful appeal in the National Football League, and Will Anderson and Joe Mixon, they are not going to be fined $25,000 for criticizing officials. The Joe Mixon one was interesting because they fined him based on a headline that he didn't say, that TJ Houshmandzadeh said. And then they said, okay, well, we're going to fine you for something else. And then I guess he appealed that, and he ended up getting it mixed. It was weird. Who would have thunk it that the NFL is even a victim of headline porn? It's not just the common folk. The NFL can be a victim of headline porn. Who would have thunk it? So there's some news. I also want to take a second to, someone says Julian Davenport was solid. Was he really solid? Was he really solid? I don't know about that. I think we also need to thank Nick Caserio. I saw Kamari Lassiter today on Twitter. Kamari Lassiter, he's not much of a social media guy. He's kind of more just about business. But he acknowledged something that was on Twitter. Let me pull this up. And it was just kind of a stat. The 33rd team put it out. And it was basically a stat of the lowest catch rates allowed among rookie DBs that saw 30-plus targets last season. I said basically. I just read it word for word. That's exactly what the fuck it was. Kamari Lassiter had 43.7%. And Kalen Bullock, right behind him, at 43.8%. The day two clinic that Nick Caserio and DeMeco Ryans put on last year, it wasn't just for this past season. It also helped you in the upcoming season because you're not in desperate need of a corner. You're not in desperate need of a tackle. And those are usually very, very, very expensive areas to be in. You also don't need a safety. They were able to find a safety. They're not desperate for a safety, which might not be considered a premium position, but they're damn hard to find. And it's damn hard to find someone that can do what Kalen Bullock did this year. So a lot of times, though, whenever a front office makes a move like that and they get that deal done, the deal's done, you kind of forget about it the next offseason. And you kind of just forget about how it could have been. Like if they had not taken a tackle, let's say they would have gotten something that was more of a dire need, then we would be sitting here right now and we'd be saying, oh my God, Titus Howard's not a good right tackle. He definitely doesn't validate the money that he was paid. And oh my gosh, they need a tackle. How in the heck is that going to happen? They don't have to do that. If they had just brought back Steven Nelson for a 1-year deal or something like that, and they didn't get Kamari Lassiter, we'd be sitting here saying, man, they need a corner. That is very tough to get. That's very expensive in free agency. And a lot of times it becomes kind of a crapshoot at 25 in the draft, unless you get lucky, which the Eagles and Texans both were very pleased with what they ended up getting on day 2 with Dejin and Lassiter. But that work that they did on day 2, it put them in a very, very good position heading into this draft. And it's got to be acknowledged, not just for last year, because we didn't really see like a major impact from Blake Fisher. But in this year's draft, Blake Fisher is probably being talked about as like a top 15, top 20, top 25 pick. Like if in this year's draft, the Texans were sitting at 25, there would probably be a large amount of people saying, man, hopefully the tackle out of Notre Dame is there when the Texans pick. And you don't have to worry about that because Caserio and DeMeco and whoever the hell's decision it was, they made the decision that they did, and they were able to bring in Blake Fisher, and they were able to bring in Kamari Lassiter, and they were able to do what they did. And that's huge. That's really, really big for not just last year's team, but it's big for this year's team. And it kind of eases the pressure of that they were facing and that they would be facing this season had they not made that move. So salute to them for doing what they did there. It worked out very, 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 very nicely. And I think it was some of their finest work. I think that day 2 was as impressive. And I said this earlier this year. I think it was as impressive as the day 1 where they got CJ and Will Anderson. Because if you have pick 2 and you have pick 12 and you have 2 first-round picks the next year and you have 33 that year, you can put together a package and go get Will Anderson. But if you have a second-round pick and you're able to do what the Texans did and handle your business like that, then that's not something that a lot of front offices can do. It's not something a lot of front offices can do. It was great. And the other thing is maybe the Stephon Diggs trade allowed that to be possible. Much like some would say you lucked into CJ Stroud at 2. Maybe you kind of lucked into Kamari Lassiter. Maybe they didn't like Kamari Lassiter that much. Maybe had they stayed in the first round, they wouldn't have taken Kamari Lassiter. I think they deserve some credit for that. M. Aaron says, just bring back Diggs. No, thank you. I'm good on that. Life Alou right after says, please don't bring Diggs back. Yeah, I'm very good on Diggs. I'm fine moving on from that. I think I'm fine with Laremy Tunsil, but sometimes, like when y'all log into your computer, do y'all get like those suggested news stories? And I don't even know who this is, but this was on my my front page when I got there. It's from SB Nation, Kenneth L. I don't even know who it is. And a lot of times it'll say like Sports Illustrated said all that, but it basically had Laremy Tunsil trade destinations. It had the Washington Commanders, the Cleveland Browns, the Pats, the Vikings, and the Ravens. And they were talking about the basic summary at first from this Kenneth L. guy was new offensive coordinator Nick Caley needs to shake up the offensive line. According to Spot Track, the Texans spend the second most on their offensive line in the league. They account for 28.9% of the team's total cap, while being the team's single biggest liability. Left tackle Laremy Tunsil, while being statistically an upper echelon lineman, has not moved the needle on the offense as intended. It's disgruntling when the highest paid player on the team also leads the team in penalties, while the interior of the offensive line let the entire team down. Tunsil consistently is allowing hurries. I don't know what that data is from. Is he really allowing hurries? I don't know. I don't know if that's really true either. But he's consistently allowing hurries and pressures, which force Stroud up into the pocket where he's duly crushed. That's interesting writing. Simply put, Houston needs to move on from Tunsil and shift either Titus Howard or second-year tackle Blake Fisher to the position. All right, this is when you know this guy's writing about this and has no idea. I don't want Titus Howard playing right tackle. I damn sure don't want him playing left tackle. I can assure you I do not want that. So no thank you to that. And then he says, let's take a look at the 5 best fits. Okay. I do think eventually it's going to come to a point when CJ Stroud is off of his rookie deal. We're going to get to a point where tough decisions are going to have to be made. Now, does that mean that getting rid of Laremy Tunsil is what you're going to do and that's going to be the tough decision? I would say probably not. That wouldn't be where we're at right now. Now, if it happened, would I be opposed? I don't know. Because my question would be, where is the tough decision going to come from? Like Kansas City, Buffalo had to just completely overhaul half their team before last season. Like they were in cap hell. They had to get rid of everybody. And they basically had to go back to square one. We've seen the Chiefs have to get rid of Tyreek Hill. We've seen the Chiefs had to get rid of Brown. We've seen the Ravens have to get rid of guys. Like eventually when you get that top tier quarterback, you get in salary cap hell and you have to make the tough decisions. Is Laremy Tunsil where the tough decision comes from? I would think so. Now, this year, it's kind of hard to imagine because we were just talking about how nice it is that the Texans don't need a tackle. I do wonder if we get like a Blake Fisher remix of some sort, where let's say that the Texans get to the second round and there's a tackle who can play guard and tackle. And maybe you can start him at guard and then in a perfect world, you're moving him to tackle and Blake Fisher and that young man are your tackles. Now, it always comes back to, well, you got to protect your quarterback. You got to protect your quarterback. Not every left tackle in the league is making $30 million. Like, we can go down that list. So is what Tunsil's giving you, is that going to be the easiest tough decision to make? I think a lot of that's going to rest on Blake Fisher. They like Blake Fisher. I like Blake Fisher. I think Blake Fisher is going to come back and be a much better football player next year than he was this year. I think he was a little bit raw this year. Offseason, we always talk about the body transformations from year 1 to year 2. I think Blake Fisher is going to improve. Now, are you going to feel comfortable putting him at left tackle? Don't know. I don't know how they feel. I thought it was weird that Julian Davenport blocked for Deshaun Watson in year 2. They won 11 games. So where are the tough decisions going to come from? You're not saying bye to Stingley, right? I don't think so. You already paid Nico. You're going to pay CJ. Eventually, you're going to have to pay Kamari Lassiter, we think. Bullock's a nice young player. The tough decisions are going to happen. Daniil Hunter, eventually, he's going to be gone. Last year, his deal this year. You're going to have to pay Will Anderson, right? He's one of your core pieces. So good teams, good organizations, teams that compete at the top, teams that have quarterbacks that get paid a lot, eventually they got to make tough decisions. It's not because the player stinks. It's because the decision has to be made somewhere. It's not baseball. the salary cap. So I don't think that it's crazy to think about life without Laremy Tunsil. I don't know if that's this year, something they do proactively. I don't know. I know when Brown got traded, stockpile picks, hit on the picks. The other thing I do wonder when it comes to Laremy Tunsil is if we're going to talk about intangibles, and we talk about it all the time, we talk about Joe Mixon, that Mixon energy. We talk about the charisma of CJ Stroud when he's having fun and doing what he's doing. DeMeco talks about the swarm mentality, iron sharpening iron. That's one of the, they say that more than they say anything else. Iron sharpens iron. We hear that every day at that facility. If iron can sharpen iron, and you have a guy who's really, really good at left tackle, always gets the awards, Pro Bowl, highest paid 2 times. Heard him say that a time or two. And the rest of the offensive line is not being elevated, then what's the opposite of iron sharpening iron? We know that he marches to the beat of his own drum. We know that. So I'm asking this because does it just not always matter? I know there's exceptions where some guys just handle their business and stuff like that. But it seems like from being in that building, from being at every DeMeco Ryans press conference, from seeing the way that this team plays, that iron sharpening iron is one of those things. Where's that happening on the offensive line? Because in a perfect world, you want that to happen with your most expensive players. It can't just be he goes out there and does his job, especially a cohesive group like the offensive line, especially a guy who has a C on his chest. So do we blame that on Bobby Slowick? Or does that get factored into play whenever they decide that they're going to have to make a tough decision when it comes to CJ, Will, Stingley, Lassiter, all these guys getting paid? Something to consider. It's not like the Texans didn't invest in the offensive line. And that's the other thing. Like, there's this notion that, well, you got to use this pick on an offensive lineman. You got to spend this money on an offensive lineman. You got to do that. They did that. You look at where other teams got their guys and how they drafted them. They weren't just drafting everyone in the first round. At some point, you got to develop some guys. When you spend a second round pick on Juice Scruggs, you got to develop it. Maybe you find somebody on day 3. Maybe you find somebody in free agency that's a little bit cheap. That's how I think about the offensive line. In a perfect world, I would like the prime draft picks to be used on wide receivers, skill position guys, defense. Develop your damn offensive line and adjust accordingly when the offensive line is shorthanded or whenever they have a certain skill set. That's going to be Nick Caley's job. But we've seen them invest. Obviously, there's multiple layers to that, but we've seen them invest. And we've seen players make offensive linemen look better. There always is like this, well, if you don't have offensive line, you can't do anything. Yeah, to a certain point. Like eventually, like if you're getting your ass kicked like Kansas City was against Philadelphia, you ain't got a chance in hell. Or like the Texans were against the Chiefs. Texans were against most teams. But you can also scheme right. You can also figure it out. So we'll see what happens with the offensive line. I think that the skill position guys are more important than the offensive line. These guys got to be coached up. And I also think, and this is getting ahead of ourselves, typically when I see something like that, I see some sort of trade rumor type of thing from an outlet, and it's just throwing stuff like that out. I kind of glaze over it, but the Laremy Tunsil thing's interesting because I think that's the tough decision that eventually you're going to have to make. Kansas City's had to say bye to their left tackle before. A lot of good teams have had to say goodbye to some really, really good players. Eventually that's going to happen. You're going to have to develop some guys. Blake Fisher was taken. I can promise you. They took Blake Fisher, and I think in their perfect world, Blake Fisher is your starting left tackle in 2 years. In their perfect world. That's what Blake Fisher is doing. It looked like a nightmare last year because there were times where he clearly looked like a rookie. But I think in their perfect world, they were drafting Blake Fisher to start at tackle. He already is. I think in their perfect world, it was he's going to eventually be your left tackle. They'll figure out what they got to do it right. Hell, they found George Fant 2 years ago. George Fant is the best right tackle they've had in the last 5-6 years. We're being honest. So let's just keep an eye on how they attack this. The draft and stuff is fun. We'll see how they attack free agency, and we'll get some sort of idea about it. But I think their most important need is they got to get these skill position guys right. And they got to coach up their offensive linemen. There's a little bit of make do with this offensive line. Primetime V says Titus should be in Nick's office volunteering to give majority of that money back with a bad contract. I don't think he's going to have a choice eventually. I think eventually it's going to be, if you want to stay here, it's a pay cut. If not, bye-bye. I think that's where we're going to get. But do you feel good? Like, there almost also seems to be this notion that, well, if Titus doesn't play right tackle, man, we can just put him at left guard. I mean, can you find something better? Like, I mean, I'm not sitting here saying that, the good for Titus, like, that's cool. But, I mean, like, is it far-fetched to think that you find something better at left guard than Titus Howard? I mean, does he just have that position on lock? Like, how hard should that be? I feel like in every draft, there's probably like someone taken on day 3. There's probably multiple guys taken on day 3 that are better at left guard than Titus Howard. Like, does he just got that on lock? I don't think that should be the case. I don't think you have to like make a premium investment in it. But is it just, hey, we don't have to worry about this? I don't know. How many teams would Titus start at left guard? I don't know. I don't know. I don't pretend to know every left guard. I would say less than a fifth. And maybe even less than that. I mean, it's on lock. Cool. You want to play guard? Cool. I mean, I think you want to hang around and start. Because right now, Blake Fisher, year 2, is the starting right tackle. But I don't know that you have to use a first-round pick or a second-round pick to find someone who can play left guard, better than Titus Howard. I think that might be easier to find. He might be either gone or he might be like an expensive kind of swing tackle / guard guy that can go play where he wants to play. I think yesterday in the chat, we still had someone kind of defending him and say, well, he went to guard, not because he stunk at tackle. Yeah, he did. Like, the reason that he went to guard was because he wasn't that great at tackle. I keep hearing this, and this is the sales pitch from DeMeco and them, but let's just be honest. We've learned this. What DeMeco says about players, he's not going to come out and criticize players. What he says about them, you got to take with a grain of salt because he's always going to protect them. And credit to him for doing that. But it keeps getting presented as like this is some big sacrifice. You weren't good at tackle. If Titus Howard was an elite tackle, they would have tried to figure out and make do at left guard in either of the seasons where they moved him to guard. I know desperate times call for desperate measures. We saw Tunney get moved to tackle this year with the Chiefs. Like, we see that desperate times call for desperate measures. I understand that. We've seen Zach Martin have to go from playing guard to tackle. Like, it happens. This ain't that. This wasn't that. They could have found just a guy to play guard. Kendrick Green could have held that down. If you had an elite tackle in Laremy Tunsil and Titus Howard was an elite tackle, they're not moving him to guard. They're going to figure something else out. Patterson, Juice, Kent, whatever. They can play some ping pong and figure that out on the interior. Like, let's stop with this notion that because Titus was fine at tackle, so they moved him to guard, because that's not what happened. So that's just kind of where they're at right now with the offensive line. It's not ideal. I think there's going to be some small changes, but I think the more pressing need is wide receiver. And thank God they feel good and they got a young tackle, so they don't have to worry about that. Because I can sleep better at night knowing that we're not sitting here still trying to fool ourselves that Titus Howard's a good right tackle. That went on for a long time. And I was fine. It's kind of like when you start talking about whether you pay guys or not. Titus Howard on the surface, his rookie deal, well done. Well done. Not even a disappointing first-round pick for all the stuff I'm saying. Well done. They did a good job. They got decent tackle play out of him. They got some versatility out of him, which they wanted. But the second that they gave Titus Howard that extension, when they didn't have to, he got hurt, which has been one of his issues. And then when he came back, didn't look like he was in the best of shape. He ended up getting moved back to guard again after saying, I'm only a right tackle. And this was after some pretty low points. The stripping of CJ Stroud, kind of being turned around a few times. It changes once you pay somebody. The expectations kind of increase. For whatever reason, they gave him that extension as if he was going to hold down the right tackle spot stress-free for the next half decade, whatever the hell the contract was for. I don't think too many people, including CJ Stroud, slept well at night knowing that CJ Stroud was protecting that side. So let's just be serious about that. Jacory says we got to bite the bullet on this O-line, just invest what we can, which is at least a chance in getting better. But those picks got to be on playmakers. Agreed completely. Coach them up. Figure it out. Titus Howard's your left guard. Figure it out. Pressure's on now. A lot of these guys are playing for their NFL life right now. Pretty much everyone in the interior. I mean, this is a big year for Juice Scruggs. Juice Scruggs kind of gets a free pass. Big year for Juice Scruggs. I think they get rid of either Shaq or Titus. Probably one of them. Titus might have to take less money. But I am very, very grateful that Blake Fisher's the starting right tackle. And I can see what he develops into and how that works. It's just where I'm at with it. See how it goes. Appreciate y'all for coming through. Subscribe, like, right along. Always remember, when it comes to this Texan stuff, we're all in it together. I say skill position more important than O-line. What say you? Congrats to Joe Mixon and Will Anderson on saving that $25K. And what player is going to be the one that the Texans have to sacrifice once they have to make tough decisions? Discuss, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Appreciate
in
it.
the headlock, localized every time. Can't stop, won't stop. Yeah, we top 2 and we not too. Plugged in daily digital on YouTube. We got taste for days. Opinions to give, we got takeaways. If it's up, then it's up. We number 1. You don't need to try your luck. Locker room, yeah, we in the locker room. Texas talk, yeah, you know what we about to do. Localize